Hey everyone, I am going to talk about the impact of Black Lives Matter movement in human resources management. This is my paper, and just a quick disclaimer, this has no prejudice about any racial identification, any biases towards any specific group. It is just purely my personal observation and my research findings in this paper. So let's begin. Starting from understanding the history of the Black Lives Movement is that it was established in 2013 by three individuals, Alicia, Patrice, and Opal. It was a Black-centered political will and movement building project that massively changed the workplace culture, beginning by the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And the purpose of this research, as I've said before, is to observe and research the impact of Black Lives Matter movement in the workplace and in the HR aspect. So prior to the term of human resources management, it was also known as personnel management. And in the beginning of the early days of personnel administration, the structures were unclear. And oftentimes we see similarity biases, also known as in-group biases, in the workplace, and it was really prevalent. Now, the methodology of this research, number one, is we compare the EEO-1 report. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission governs the United States equal employment aspect. So organizations, employers specifically, who have at least 100 employees or federal contractors who have at least 50 employees are required to submit an EEO-1 report. This is a snapshot of a specific organization, and as you can see on the little tabs, it has little key indicators such as male, female, white, black, African American, and so on. Oftentimes, you will see these questions being asked when you apply for job opportunities in Indeed, Glassdoor, and so on. And then if you look at the numbers, they total up, and then they can compare the numbers before. So the year in 2020, you can compare it to the year 2019, and so on, to measure the differences in the changes. So what the Black Lives Matter movement has impacted, as when we observe an annual diversity report, this specifically is Google's annual diversity report. So the hires, as you can see in the 2019 compared to the 2020 annual report, there are specific changes. And these numbers do not accurately represent what should be the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, because we can't just look at one organization and assume that the rest, or that the movement actually made a progress. So to speak, the movement does not advocate for an increase in hiring minorities. However, I digress. As we move on, we can see some differences. The Google Annual Diversity Report was based on 2019 and 2020, and there were indicators. Since 2014, there has been large gains for women in the tech global industry. So steady gains in representation for communities, especially in the minority groups. So the reducing biases is one of those goals that allowed Google to recruit more employees from a more diverse background. One of the examples is that the women applicants decrease dramatically when a job qualification summary is more than 54 words. So in the end, acknowledgement of the Black Lives Matter movement allows organizations to be more accountable in driving representation gains, especially in the hiring and retaining talented professionals from underrepresented groups. Now, the next method we are going to use in my paper is the demographic movement observation. First of all, when we are identifying where people live is another method in measuring how diverse a sample population is. So the idea is that the more diverse a population is, the more diverse an organization would be, assuming since most of the people commute to work on a daily basis. If you look at bigger cities such as New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, you would see a bigger and more diverse background compared to rural areas. which continues to the point, according to Frey, the America's population is more racially diverse than ever before, with 4 out of every 10 residents projected to identify as a non-white racial group. So particularly in the rural areas of with an all-white neighborhood, achieving a workplace diversity is a difficult task, as limited job opportunities are available, and for minorities to start settling in would be difficult as well. So imagine if you are in a all-white neighborhood, there will be challenges in reaching diversity despite the opportunity and the inclusion. So the Black Lives Matter movement did alter the way employers think about diversity and inclusion. However, there is a higher chance that a minority would not opt for an organization that are present in a proximity of an all-white neighborhood. So simply because there is a potential segregation and the lack of inclusion in the location they might dwell in the future. So despite the want and the need and the push from the Black Lives Matter movement for more diversity and inclusion, sometimes employers find it difficult to seek diversity in the workplace because there is a limited candidate pool. Now, the research findings that I'm going to talk about is my observation and some observations from other people regarding to the movement. Now, this is a simple timeline that I created. So measuring 3 years of the history of the movement. So it was established in 2013. And since then, there has been strong advocates for the movement. However, it wasn't superly present in media. However, in 2020, with the killing of George Floyd, it was a catalyst for a faster movement. And in 2021, we can see more increased awareness in minorities. So the observation is that the Black Lives Matter movement has changed the dynamic of modern society regarding embedded racism. So we start seeing, because of social media, we start seeing a lot more people who have no idea about the change of dynamics and starting to see people coming out to stand for their own rights and their own beliefs. Now, most organizations find that it is difficult to change. However, you will see a noticeable example is that employers started to recognize the gravity of the racial unrest by celebrating for the first time Juneteenth on June 19th, 2020, which is a holiday that celebrates the emancipation of slaves. So that is one thing that employers were doing in 2020. Now, some organizations disagree with the participation of that, and some groups of people find it different, and that's why they started standing out and showing their beliefs. Now, key indicators to be aware of in the research finding is when asking questions about the applicant's education level. So in an interview, it would be somewhat discriminatory to ask about their CGPA, gender, age, and so on. As we see in most of the applications, there is an opportunity to not answer those questions. However, in the future, it might pertain to discrimination. So employers are absolutely prohibited from asking these questions that might lead to discrimination or even the appearance of discrimination. So in the future, we might be seeing less questions about asking whether you are male or female, of your national origin, your racial ethnicity profile. So in the future, they will be asking straight to the point. So even questions that are normal in an everyday conversation between two individuals, for example, if a person is interviewing for a job, they somehow open-endedly tells the employer that they are pregnant, and if the employer asks about how old is your baby and all that, potentially it could lead to discrimination. Now, it is difficult to distinguish between performative allyship from authentic and genuine intentions. So whether the organizations were having hashtag BLM slogans in their corporate social media accounts for the sake of jumping on the bandwagon, or the fact that the management is actually keen in changing policies. It is still in the dark, and there's limited numbers showing this change. So upon my personal observation, some organizations still include questions, like I've mentioned before, about questions about racial ethnicity. They would ask you, are you Native American or something, so on. However, there is a reason why they would continue asking, is because potentially they are highly engaged with the government, and it would take some time for them to change the way they ask questions. Now, in the discussion, implementing a change in hiring policies is what certain organizations have done. For instance, some organizations adopted the Rooney Rule, which allows businesses to require at least one female and one non-white candidate to be considered among the candidates for every open leadership positions. Now, there could be a problem, because with this there could be a decrease in biases, specifically biased succession planning. However, as we move along, we can still see some organizations lacking the resources needed for succession planning, for the recruitment of candidates. And if an organization is in dire need of recruiting a specific candidate, they would have to do some modifications to the job and so on. So there could be a problem of not including, racial and diversity. So that could be a problem. Now, Google implemented something called the shifting of culture fit, culture ads. So what they did was they changed the perspective of how underrepresented groups would add to Google's culture, and not simply of how they fit in. This is one of those great examples of shifting the needs of hiring and shifting the potential biases that could be seen in an organization. Another test would be the disparate impact test. So the disparate impact test could determine the number of majority workers, and from there onwards use it as a sample size to determine whether the number of hired candidates pertains a disparate impact conclusion. So one of those great examples that I've actually included is this. It's the 4/5 rule. So where you take the majority of the workers, such as a male recruiter, a male worker, an employee, we multiply by 4/5, and then we get a percentage. And now we compare the other selected and recruited persons, and then we can see a percentage. So if any numbers that is lower than that specific percentage, it could have a disparate impact. Now, there's also another factor we can look in, is to limit referral hiring. So it was mentioned that the similar to me effect that was shown when people are similar to them. So deeper considerations of these factors is how an organization can quickly hire employees that refer others who are similar to them, which in return could lead to further disparate impact. So if, for an example, if it's a minority person, they would most likely refer their own minority friends, if we are assuming that they are having more of a closer proximity. However, there's different alternatives. So referral hiring is one of the great options for organizations to retain employees. However, they have to consider the disparate impact potential.